London, in the first days of winter, seemed to breathe a cold and glassy indifference toward those who wandered its streets without purpose, and Lady Eleanor Whitcomb felt that indifference settle upon her shoulders as she stepped from her carriage and into the brilliance of the Montclair Assembly. She had attended such gatherings since girlhood, yet each passing year made the chandeliers brighter, the floors more polished, and the quiet cruelties more sharply defined. At 40, she stood in the doorway like an echo of an older world, dignified but unfashionable, graceful yet dismissed before she even crossed the threshold. She carried herself with the composure expected of a baronet's daughter, though her heart beat with the wary caution of a woman who had long ago learned that society noticed her only to mock her. The room glittered with youth, swirling gowns of pale satin, powdered shoulders, and bouquets pinned to bodices barely out of girlhood. Laughter flowed like sparkling wine, quick and light, without regard for the bruises it might leave. Eleanor paused to observe it all, knowing no one would come rushing to greet her, and knowing she would still offer a polite smile to any who cared to look her way. She had not come for admiration, she had come because absence invited louder whispers than presence. Better to stand silent among them than be spoken of as a reclusive curiosity. As she moved across the ballroom, she sensed eyes turning toward her, some quickly diverted, others lingering with thinly veiled amusement. Young ladies whispered behind painted fans, their gazes flitting toward her as though studying a cautionary legend. Eleanor kept her chin high, not out of pride but out of necessity, for she understood that dignity was a fragile shield. One crack, and the room would tear her apart. She greeted acquaintances with gentle courtesy, each interaction a reminder that politeness was not affection, and that civility did not erase the chasm between being tolerated and being wanted. Near the musicians' gallery, she overheard a cluster of débutantes, their voices too sharp with youth to temper their cruelty. One of them, her cheeks flushed from dancing, remarked with theatrical sighing, "If I ever reach her age unwed, I pray someone locks me away before I become tonight's cautionary spectacle." The surrounding girls erupted into soft, malicious laughter, their curls bouncing, their bracelets chiming like little bells of mockery. Eleanor felt the sting, a cold needle threading itself through her composure, yet she did not flinch. She merely shifted her gaze to the marble floor and allowed the echo of their laughter to fade behind the music, as though she could command it to lose its power. She drifted toward the edge of the room where the candles cast a gentler light, and there she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the tall windows, a woman of elegant bearing, with dark hair threaded lightly with silver, and eyes that held more quiet wisdom than she had ever felt free to show. She did not begrudge the young their brightness, but she mourned the way society believed a woman's worth dimmed with every year beyond 20. It was not the absence of a husband that pained her, but the assumption that her unmarried state was a failure rather than a choice shaped by circumstance and a longing for something more than convenience. The evening progressed with familiar patterns. Men passed her by, offering nods instead of invitations. Matrons smiled with pity, as if performing a charitable act. Eleanor accepted it with the trained serenity of someone who had endured this ritual many times. She reminded herself that wounds were less dangerous when expected. Yet tonight, for reasons she could not name, the humiliation felt sharper, as though the room itself had conspired to magnify her isolation. Perhaps it was the laughter she had overheard. Perhaps it was simply the fatigue of fighting the same silent battle year after year. Then, quite suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations softened, forming a low ripple across the assembly. Eleanor felt a change before she identified its cause, a subtle tightening of attention, as though every gaze were pulled toward the grand staircase. She followed the collective motion of the crowd and saw him descending with the composed authority of a man unaccustomed to being ignored. Duke Henry Blackwell, widowed, respected, recently returned from diplomatic duties abroad. His presence struck the room like a quiet thunder, and even those who pretended indifference could not resist glancing his way. Eleanor had seen him before, though only from a distance, and had never imagined he might see her in return. Yet as he reached the bottom of the staircase and allowed the host to greet him, his eyes wandered across the ballroom, and found her. The moment stretched, delicate and improbable. There was no pity in his gaze, none of the smug sympathy others offered her. Instead, there was something like recognition, as though he perceived not the woman society scorned but the woman she had fought to remain despite it all. Eleanor's breath caught, but she looked away before the moment grew presumptuous. She reminded herself that men of his rank acknowledged women like her only out of politeness or passing curiosity. Whatever he had seen in her face was accidental, a flicker of attention easily dismissed. And yet, as she stepped toward the refreshment table to recompose herself, she felt the faint spark of something she had not experienced in years, the awareness of being observed without malice. The music shifted into a livelier country dance, and the crowd surged toward the center of the floor. Eleanor remained where she was, content to watch, though a quiet ache pulsed beneath her ribs. She told herself she would stay no longer than a quarter hour more. She had fulfilled her duty, she had endured enough. Yet just as she reached for her cloak, she sensed, rather than saw, a figure pause at the threshold of her solitude. She turned slightly. The Duke was standing a short distance away, not approaching, not withdrawing, simply watching. His expression held a calm certainty that unsettled her, as though he were contemplating a decision she could not yet fathom. Before she could fully process the moment, someone called his name from across the room, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. When he glanced back at her, his gaze lingered with unmistakable intent. It lasted only a breath. Then he stepped away. Eleanor remained still, heart steady yet altered, aware that something quiet and significant had shifted in the night's arrangement, something that made her delay her departure, if only to understand what it meant. The following morning arrived with a pale, reluctant sun, casting a muted glow across the Whitcomb townhouse as Eleanor descended to the breakfast room. She expected the day to pass with its usual quiet routine, yet a small box awaited her on the sideboard, placed with an almost ceremonial precision. Inside lay a single red camellia, its petals flawless and startling against the modest surroundings. Eleanor stared at it with a mixture of confusion and guarded hope, uncertain whether to believe it was meant for her. No note accompanied the flower, no explanation to soften the shock of receiving such a rare bloom in winter. She closed the box gently, unwilling to imagine significance where none existed. News of the mysterious token traveled swiftly, carried by the restless machinery of London gossip. By midday, whispers circled through drawing rooms, suggesting the flower was evidence of Eleanor's attempt to attract attention she had long been denied. Some speculated a clerk or gardener had mistaken the recipient, others insisted she herself had crafted the illusion to revive a fading reputation. Eleanor learned of these murmurs when a distant cousin arrived for tea, wearing a smile too polished to be sincere. He asked whether she had received a most intriguing delivery, his tone betraying his eagerness for scandal. Eleanor answered with measured calm, yet the humiliation lodged itself deeply, for she knew society relished any opportunity to diminish her dignity. As the day waned, Eleanor sought refuge in the conservatory, hoping the soft rustle of leaves would quiet her mind. She was arranging the camellia among her gardening notes when the butler entered to announce an invitation from Lady Atherton, whose gatherings attracted London's sharpest intellects. Eleanor hesitated, aware that attending so soon after the gossip might invite scrutiny, yet she refused to allow rumor to dictate her movements. She accepted with steady composure, and spent the evening preparing herself not with finery, but with the calm resolve to endure whatever awaited her. The camellia remained on her desk, a silent question she could neither dismiss nor embrace fully. Lady Atherton's conservatory glowed with lamplight the following evening, the glass walls reflecting soft golden hues that made the guests appear like figures suspended within a dream. Eleanor stepped carefully among clusters of scholars, poets, and statesmen, grateful for the atmosphere of intellectual curiosity that usually overshadowed superficial gossip. Yet even here, she sensed eyes drifting toward her with heightened interest. She tightened her grip on her gloves, reminding herself that endurance was not weakness but discipline. As she moved toward a display of winter roses, she heard a familiar murmur ripple through the crowd, and when she turned, she found the Duke of Blackwell standing at the entrance, surveying the room with composed intensity. Unlike the ballroom, the conservatory seemed to hold its breath at his arrival, for he was a man whose presence seldom went unnoticed. Eleanor felt a flicker of uncertainty, unsure whether to acknowledge him or retreat into anonymity. Before she could decide, he approached a nearby group, though his gaze wandered in her direction with deliberate subtlety. She attempted to concentrate on the roses, tracing their delicate petals with thoughtful admiration, yet her mind refused to settle. The Duke's earlier attention at the assembly had unsettled her more than she cared to admit, and his appearance tonight felt neither accidental nor casual, though she dared not interpret his motives. When Lady Atherton requested Eleanor to read a passage aloud from a newly published volume of essays, she complied with practiced grace, though her voice trembled slightly at first. As she read, the room grew still, her measured cadence filling the conservatory with a quiet eloquence that commanded attention. When she concluded, polite applause followed, but the Duke's response differed. He stepped forward and offered a remark praising her interpretation with thoughtful seriousness. His words were neither extravagant nor idle, yet something in his tone conveyed genuine respect. Eleanor thanked him with restrained courtesy, unsettled by the disarming sincerity of his manner. After the reading concluded, Eleanor attempted to withdraw into a quieter corner, but the Duke, after completing a courteous exchange with the host, approached her with a calm deliberation that left her breath suspended. He greeted her with a tone that suggested long-considered respect rather than spontaneous politeness, and though she answered with dignity, she found herself uncharacteristically aware of each word she spoke. Their conversation drifted toward literature, then politics, and finally the subtle pressures of society, each topic unfolding with unexpected ease. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar lightness, as though she had stepped briefly outside the rigid expectations that had long defined her. The Duke listened with disarming attentiveness, occasionally offering reflections that revealed a depth of thought beyond his public reputation. She found herself studying him, noticing the quiet steadiness in his eyes and the unhurried patience with which he regarded her, as though he wished to learn the truths she seldom shared. As their exchange drew to a natural pause, he inclined his head with a gentleness that carried unexpected weight. Before Eleanor could fully interpret his manner, a soft murmur spread across the conservatory, signaling that others had taken notice of their prolonged conversation. She felt the familiar tremor of apprehension, aware that even innocent exchanges could be reshaped into scandal by eager tongues. The Duke seemed to sense her unease, for he stepped back with a respectful composure that neither abandoned the moment nor encouraged further speculation. He offered a parting remark, quietly expressing that he hoped their discussion might continue on another occasion, should she permit it. His words settled into her thoughts with disarming clarity, leaving her both steadied and unsettled. After he withdrew, Eleanor remained motionless among the roses, conscious that something subtle yet irrevocable had altered the rhythm of her days. The camellia, the whispers, the unexpected conversation, all had converged into a fragile possibility she had not dared imagine. Though uncertainty lingered, a quiet anticipation unfurled within her softly. Below is exactly 1,000 words. Eleanor had grown accustomed to mornings that unfolded with predictable gentleness, yet the day following the conservatory gathering carried an unsettled stillness, as though the world itself waited for her next breath. The Duke's conversation lingered in her thoughts with a quiet persistence she tried, and failed, to dispel. She reminded herself that respect was not affection, and that a thoughtful exchange did not signify intent. Still, the memory of his steady gaze refused to fade. She spent the morning in her study, attempting to read, yet every sentence dissolved beneath the weight of her own distraction. When the butler announced the arrival of a sealed note, she accepted it with apprehension, recognizing the elegant script instantly. The Duke requested permission to call upon her that afternoon for a brief walk through the Whitcomb Gardens, phrased with impeccable courtesy yet unmistakable purpose. Eleanor felt her breath catch, wondering whether accepting the invitation would place her in danger of ridicule, yet refusing it seemed equally unwise, for she sensed he would not have written unless compelled by sincerity. After a moment's hesitation, she sent her acceptance, though her hand trembled slightly when she sealed the reply. She spent the hours before his arrival in a state of restless composure, wandering from room to room as though searching for an anchor she had lost without noticing. The Duke arrived precisely at the appointed hour, offering a greeting shaped by both formality and warmth. He admired the gardens with quiet reverence, noting their winter resilience, but Eleanor sensed a deeper intention beneath his observations. When they reached a secluded path lined with bare rose bushes, he paused, folding his hands behind his back with uncharacteristic uncertainty. His voice, usually so composed, carried a softer timbre as he confessed that he had observed her for years, not out of idle curiosity, but out of a profound respect for her strength amidst society's unkindness. Eleanor felt the world narrow, her pulse quickening as he spoke of the grace with which she endured ridicule, the intelligence she concealed behind measured restraint, and the quiet dignity he believed far rarer than beauty. She struggled to respond, torn between disbelief and the fragile hope that his words might hold truth. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a trembling candor she had seldom revealed. She admitted that she had resigned herself to being unseen, not because she lacked feeling, but because she feared the cruelty that often followed a woman of her age. The Duke listened with an attentiveness that steadied her, his expression free of judgment. He assured her that admiration did not require youth, and that affection, when genuine, transcended the superficial standards society clung to. For a suspended moment, they stood in stillness, the winter air sharpening the intimacy of their shared vulnerability. Their exchange might have ended there, tender yet private, had a rustle not sounded from behind the hedges. A servant, startled at being discovered, attempted a clumsy bow before hurrying away, but the alarm in his eyes revealed the danger immediately. Eleanor felt dread coil within her, knowing how swiftly careless observation could be reshaped into scandal. The Duke attempted to reassure her, insisting that propriety had not been breached. Yet Eleanor understood the nature of gossip. Facts mattered far less than suggestion. When he departed later that afternoon, he did so with visible concern, promising he would not allow their innocent conversation to become her burden. By the next morning, London was alive with speculation. The story had warped into a whispered claim that Eleanor had engineered a private meeting in hopes of trapping the Duke into courtship. Invitations were rescinded with thin excuses, acquaintances avoided her with exaggerated politeness. Eleanor endured it all with the same composure she had always shown, yet inside she felt the ache of humiliation deepen. She feared not only for her reputation but also for the Duke, whose position rendered him vulnerable to political manipulation. She told herself she should distance him from her troubles, even if it meant forfeiting the connection that had begun to take root. The Duke, however, refused to retreat. When he visited her again, this time openly, in the full view of passing carriages, he made his intentions unmistakable. He spoke with firm conviction, declaring that he would not allow her name to be tarnished by falsehoods, nor permit his admiration to be twisted into scandal. Eleanor attempted to caution him, urging consideration of the consequences, but he quieted her with a steady insistence that respectability held little value if it required cowardice. His determination unsettled and emboldened her in equal measure. The decisive moment arrived at the Royal Garden Fête, where the city's most influential figures gathered beneath vibrant canopies and lavish floral displays. Eleanor attended reluctantly, wishing only to avoid further attention, but the Duke sought her out almost immediately. Conversations faltered as he approached, and the crowd thinned subtly, forming a corridor of curious onlookers. When he reached her, he offered his arm not with hesitation but with solemn deliberation, an action so public and undeniable that it silenced every whisper. Eleanor felt the weight of 100 gazes, yet beneath it she sensed a quiet shift inside herself, a steadying, a reclaiming of dignity long eroded. The Duke's voice carried clearly as he announced his intention to court her formally, ensuring every witness heard the truth rather than twisted rumor. His declaration rendered the crowd momentarily breathless, for no one had expected such decisive defiance of social expectation. Eleanor met his gaze, seeing not gallantry but earnest devotion, and she allowed her hand to rest upon his arm. For the remainder of the fête, they walked with measured grace, speaking in low tones that held both vulnerability and newfound courage. Eleanor understood that their future would not be free of scrutiny, yet she no longer felt alone in facing it. The Duke's choice had altered more than her reputation. It had rekindled a quiet belief that affection, when rooted in sincerity, could withstand even the sharpest judgment. Their steps through the gardens marked the beginning of a path neither had anticipated, but both were willing to walk with deliberate hope.